Hey there, friends. I hope that you enjoy this episode of the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast as much as I enjoyed making it. I want to take a moment here at the beginning to extend a special offer, an invitation to you, our dear listeners, to join the Remembering course. Our next start date is going to be in middle of March. This is a powerful, deeply moving, and for many people, transformational experience into the heart of colonization, climate change, family histories, ancestors, and so many other critical intersecting pieces. Just visit our website, Sequoia Samanvaya. All the information is in the link below. Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. My name is Sara Jolena Wolcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. In this podcast, we offer up to you, dear listener, 3 forms of episodes to support your journey of remembering and reenchanting. First, conversations with amazing people. Second, storytelling. And third, myth casting. In this episode, we're going to bring you a conversation between myself and another amazing, fascinating leader in the areas of remembering and reenchanting. Welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. I am delighted today to be speaking with a woman who has been a stand for the repair and rebalancing of our relationship with Mother Earth. And as part of that, for women around the world for many decades, Osprey Oreille Lake. Osprey is probably best known for being the founder and executive director of Women's Earth and Climate Action Network International, often referred to, as we will hear, by the acronym WECAN. WECAN International is a solutions-based organization established to engage women worldwide in public advocacy, on-the-ground projects, trainings, and movement building for global climate justice. This work has taken her from the grassroots advocacy to stop pipelines and deforesting, to work with BIPOC and Indigenous leaders, policymakers, and diverse coalitions to build climate justice, resilient communities, and a just transition to a decentralized, democratized, clean energy future. She sits on the executive committee for the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and is on the steering committee for the Fossil-Free Non-Proliferation Treaty. She is the author of the award-winning book, Uprisings for the Earth, Reconnecting Climate with Nature, and her new book, The Story is in Our Bones, How Worldviews and Climate Justice Can Remake a World in Crisis, is part of what has prompted the conversation with her today. She lives in the San Francisco Bay Area on Coast Miwok lands, from which she is talking with us today. Osprey, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you today.
When I read your book, and I do follow WECAN's email list and have been to several of your events and international forums such as COP, I am quite taken by the truly amazing group of women you get to work with and the number of sacred places you have been able to travel around the world. It's really unusual. I know from my own experience that very few people get entry into the kinds of diverse spaces that you do. I don't think you would have been able to get into these places and trusted by so many Indigenous women if you yourself were not a good listener. So I'm actually hoping that before we get into the substance that is the book, that we can actually step back a little bit and start with something that I'm surmising is really fundamental to your work. How did you learn how to listen?
It's a really wonderful question. I think a lot of it is around understanding that it's a time where we have not been listening. And so, what does it mean to step back from centering the narratives that we grew up with in modern Western society, and the background that I grew up with as, a white person in the United States of America, and opening my heart and mind to realizing that, even in my youth, that things were not as they were presented to be. And from that perspective, seeing that not just me, but so many of us need to open our thinking and our perspective and our worldviews and our understanding to a very different way of living and thinking, which means, first of all, being in a positive way critical about the information we have shared, have learned, and has been shared with us historically, to a very different and honest and decolonized understanding of the world. And one of the first steps in doing so is quieting our own minds and opening our minds to listening to others. And for me, specifically, listening to Indigenous, Black, and Brown women leaders and their incredible offerings of their experience of struggle and solutions and worldviews and ways of living. And so it means part of listening is actually understanding why we have not been listening, but also being willing to be critical and assess our own assumptions, and being willing to open our minds to very different ways of knowing and thinking. And I think that's sort of the first step, which is not always easy to do. And I'm certainly not perfect at it. It's a process, it's a practice, and also can be uncomfortable. So I think part of listening is also being willing to be uncomfortable as we change and learn and grow.
It certainly resonates with a lot of my own experience. The thing you're saying about part of listening is opening yourself to knowing and thinking in different ways, and opening our minds and our hearts. And obviously, for all of our stories and for all of our journeys, as always, it's never just one moment. Time is not an object, it's very fluid. But I'm wondering if there is a particular story, maybe a story that is resonating in your bones this morning, that you can share with us about a moment when you began to open your heart mind in a different way than what you had been taught growing up.
Well, certainly there's so many stories I could share of profound mentors that I've had, and Indigenous leaders I've had the honor of spending time with. But I think, what first comes to mind actually is my relationship directly with nature. What popped into my mind when you asked the question is, I had pretty much, in my youth, I grew up in the city of San Francisco, and then had a very abrupt personal life change in our family dynamics, which led my mother to raise my sister and I as a single mom in the town of Mendocino, a very small town in Northern California, which was very startling for me at first, being a city kid, having to make this adjustment of living in the country. But I had the opportunity, I think when I was around 14 or 15, somewhere in there, to be introduced to going with a group of people on about a 2.5 week backpack trip into the high Sierras, where we were as kids going to go and clean up a lot of the backcountry from people leaving garbage out there. And why I say all this is that I remember one night, it's the first time I had actually been in, quote unquote wilderness. I don't really use that term anymore now, having learned so much about Indigenous peoples and their ongoing relationship with all the biomes and ecosystems and caretaking of all the lands. So at the time, calling it a wilderness, it's the first time I had really been away from all of the cityscape, if you will, and devices. And I was laying out under the stars, and I just, I think we all have these different experiences of life. I don't think it's unique to me, but it was my moment of looking up at the stars and realizing that everything that I had understood about reality was turned upside down, like the vastness of the universe and being out on the land and having the trees talk to me and the plants and the animals and lots of time and quietude and just realizing, oh my goodness, we're on a planet. And of course, I've read about that even as a child, but to actually have an embodied experience of the vastness of the universe and the cosmos deeply impacted me and sort of turned my world upside down.
So I love that you started there, because the first page in your book is you start with the idea of tutored by the stars, which is actually telling a story of a different moment many, many, many years later, when you were witnessing the campfire in 2018. And the smoke that blanketed California and the ways in which the stars keep guiding and speaking to you. And of course, in that is the invitation, the ways in which we can keep turning our attention, not just to our screens and to other people, but we can keep turning our attention to the more than human world for guidance and for support. And that we have to, on some level.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that one of the most powerful transformations that we can have right now is reconnecting with Mother Earth, with nature, with the plants, the animals, the trees, the rivers, the forests, and that it's not the only reason, but I think it's one of the most vital reasons that we are in a polycrisis right now, is that most of humanity has become so disconnected from the web of life that we are so out of balance that the decisions that governments are making, financial institutions are making, corporations are making, are based on a fundamental disconnect from the very web of life, from the earth that gives us everything to live. And so the more that we can connect our bodies, our stories, our narrative, our existence, where we get our food, how we drink our water every day, how we live our lives, that reweaving is absolutely essential if we have any chance or hope of making it through the moment that we're in, whether we want to talk about the climate crisis, environmental degradation, the wars that are going on, the fact of colonization. We could go on with the negative list, which is our reality. And of course, not even evenly, because Indigenous, Black and Brown communities experience these negative impacts even more than everyone else. But within that context, one of the most fundamental imbalances is that we are not connected to the web of life and nature. And it is deeply impacting not only how we treat Mother Earth, but one another.
We're listening to something else. And we're listening to something else, and part of what you're describing in your book is people are not able to hear, in part because of what you're referencing, and I also have used similar language to the worldviews that we're holding. And you describe worldviews as portals, and I'm just wondering if we can kind of look at that a tiny bit. What is it? What do you, just to help spell out just a little bit, what does it mean for worldview and a cosmovision and a cosmography to be a portal, a doorway, an entryway into something.
Yeah, I was really intrigued by this idea of a worldview when I entered into writing my book, because, as you mentioned earlier, at the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network at WECAN, I'm involved every single day with very, very practical issues of the climate crisis, and working particularly with women and gender diverse leaders on the front lines of the climate crisis. And that can mean everything from UN climate policies to reforestation projects, to protecting lands from deforestation, protecting land defenders. We do a lot of work around food sovereignty and food security. So, very, very practical projects, which we infuse with worldview and different ideas. But when I look to how we need a paradigm shift and deep systemic change, I need to go upstream. And I became very interested in, what is behind all this activity, and how did we get into these different crises and imbalances? And for me, this leads to our fundamental worldview. And, so that it's more explicit, a worldview is really a vast topic and huge in scope, with, I think, dramatic differences depending on culture, environment, ancestry, mythology, epistemology, and so many other things. And in my book, I'm really exploring how to address any great dilemma, that we really need to examine how we perceive it and approach it. And for me, that has really been looking at this portal or entry point of transformation, which I think are worldviews. And I don't think we can really enact the level of imagination and relationships and ethics that are now needed unless we really understand the fundamental nature of a particular culture and how it operates, and where we understand perception. And that, I think, has a lot to do with worldviews, because they influence how we behave, our dreams, our imaginings, and, as we've been talking about, our relationship to the web of life. And so for me, the worldview becomes, the entry point, the portal of change. I don't think that our current dominant social mindsets and systems are actually capable of addressing the crises we face, or providing a flourishing way ahead. So understanding worldviews is really vital to entering new thresholds of living. And in this sense, I think some worldviews need actually radical dismantling and reimagining. And then there's other worldviews that really need to be remembered or rescued, our relationship through our ancestries of the times when we did have a different relationship and balanced view of being in the web of life. So it's both sort of a dismantling process as well as reclaiming process. I think both are really going on right now.
Absolutely. And it's what you're saying really resonates with a lot of conversations I'm having right now. And in particular with something that I'm frequently find myself saying to others, which is that in order for groups of settlers or white folks or people who are deeply in the dominant culture worldview, in order for them to engage authentically with the big questions of the multiple crises at hand, and particularly if they want to have relationships, authentic relationships, they can go somewhere and be meaningful, with particularly Indigenous leaders, there is a great need to reflect on their own worldview and to even understand that they have one, and that it is part of the problem, and that the extent to which the dominant worldview makes it very hard to actually listen to what people have been saying, particularly Indigenous peoples, for at least 500 years to their European neighbors and counterparts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a deep dive question, and I think one that has to be approached with a lot of delicate and careful navigation, because on the one hand, for me, I think that, it is a time we must truly listen to Indigenous leadership, because just at every level, from the fact that 80% of the biodiversity left on Earth is in the lands and hands of Indigenous peoples. That means the last of the fresh water, the last of the forests. Indigenous peoples, their sovereignty and rights is so critical for all of us to support, because the worldview that they are holding is how we can all learn from living in right relationship with the land. And so I think, this has become a very critical component of my daily work and daily understanding, is to uplift Indigenous peoples, their voices, their rights, and leadership at a critical time when we all need to learn from their ways of living and knowledge systems, and respect what they have been sharing with the world for many, many years, and understand the incredible violence that has been perpetuated against Indigenous peoples, and the healing and reparations that are needed because of that. And to recognize that most of us, at least here in the United States, but in other lands around the world, are also living on stolen lands. And what does that mean? And how do we create reparations for that fact? And again, so much of this goes back to looking at root causes of the dilemmas that we're having, the root causes of the crises that we're in, because we can't really repair them or heal them or create a new system going forward without going to the root causes and healing them. We can't just run over the top of them or spiritually bypass them or politically bypass them. We need to have deep healing at this point, no different than when we're trying to heal ourselves of childhood wounds. We can't skip over the top of them. We need to investigate them, interrogate them, bring healing to them, understand them. And it's not to indulge in them, but it is because this is what healing requires, is to go to the roots of things and go into those difficult areas to bring light and healing in a very authentic, real way, whatever that process is. In the same way, I think we need to really be sitting at the feet of Indigenous people and learning from them as we are on their lands. But who are we and how do we show up to that conversation makes a huge difference, because we don't want to be engaged in cultural appropriation. We want to be good listeners. And that also is reflecting in words that you shared, like, how do we arrive at that conversation, bringing as much of ourselves forward as we can. So we've done our homework, if you will, and bring with us the basket that we can. And so in my book, I'm also talking a lot about how it's really crucial to recall our own ancestries, wherever we come from, and to go back to our own Indigenous roots at some point in time. And that's not easy to do. For many of us, those roots have been withered under colonization, religious conquests, patriarchy, and other forms of oppression. So, reconnecting with our own ancestries, our own original instructions, our own Indigenous knowledge is to really embark on a long tracking expedition, because many of us do not live in the lands of our ancestors or have access to ancestral knowledge directly. And many times when I'm talking about this, it's not just our recent ancestry. I'm particularly talking about our pre-colonized, pre-patriarchal ancestry, going back to when we actually were connected to the land. And for me, this means to engage in various ways of knowing through a very shifting landscape. And so it can be realized through the importance of collecting knowledge together, embarking on research. Even if we only find bits and pieces of our ancestral knowledge, every part of it is filled with layers of meaning that we can continue to dive into. I've done a lot of research into goddess traditions of my own ancestors, which is very helpful in terms of understanding our rootedness in the land and the earth. We can share this research and scholarship, communicating with people who perhaps live where our ancestors once walked, if we can't go there and travel there in person. And so I think there's a variety of things and an ecosystem of methodologies that we can use, but I think it's part of the journey is to look at our pre-patriarchal, pre-colonized homelands and older earth-based stories. And through this collective effort, we can find important trails to help us regenerate a more earth-centered worldview and a code of conduct that is more respectful to nature, but also to everyone around us. Again, I just want to emphasize it's not an easy task after hundreds and hundreds of years of violence and purposeful obliteration. It's sort of intergenerational work that we can take on for generations to come. And we repair and heal what we can of the tattered historical tapestry now as we weave new threads. And then I think the last part I'd like to just add into this, because it's sort of another way of inviting in other ways of knowing, is that I think portions of this process can be likened to the biological and psychological phenomena called atavism and genetic memory. And atavism occurs when an organism regains an ancestral trait that was thought to have been lost through generations of evolution. And this might happen through a variety of organic processes, but it points to the remarkable fact that the gene sequence never really disappears, which kind of really fascinated me when I started studying this. It's just dormant, if you will. So genetic memory is a memory that appears to have been inherited without our having experienced it directly or even being told about it. So as an example, there are Subhucine birds raised from birth in soundproof rooms that will sing the songs of their ancestors, having never heard them before. And many human savants display a great artistic or mathematical prowess, as an example, after an injury or a disease. And scientists tell us that these shocks to the brain can activate their genetic memories. So I only mention this because I think it's also important to realize that there are ways that the title of the book, the stories are in our bones, if you will, literally inside our bodies, are the calling of our ancestral memories, waiting to be retrieved and spoken and sung to the people and the land once again. And I think that's what pulled me to the title of the book, is this very, very conversation about how components of our blood that we need to survive are also carriers of our DNA. And every day, billions of new blood cells are produced in our bones. And this involves hemiotoposis, which is a term originating from the Greek word haima, which means blood, and poiesis, to make. And I think that the bones are a place of life and memory and world making. And so, weaving this all together, it's sort of this sense that there is like this research we need to do, which is absolutely vital, because the stories are out there when we look at, ancient goddess figurines or study the stone wheels of ancient Europe. I mean, those stories are there. They're in the land, they're in the language, but they're also in our bones when we connect to the land and our memories. And all of those things are necessary now, as I think we come to terms that we need to reconnect with the land and each other in a really different way. And then when we go to Indigenous peoples, we can bring a more embodied experience of ourselves to that conversation.
You're speaking, I love how you're kind of giving both a mythological and a scientific dimension to the need of this time, and to what it means to be engaging with questions of our own ancestry, by which I mean for people of European descent to be engaging with their European ancestry that is sometimes really, really, you had to go what feels like quite far back, although in the grand scope of humanness is not particularly that far back, and to reclaim and hear again. And the reminder that for those of European descent, this knowledge is within our bones as well as it is within the stories and embodied memories and traditional ecological knowledge of our friends and kin in who are carrying Indigenous more contemporary Indigenous heritages. And it's easy to lose track of that. And it's easy. And when we do so, of course, we, as you are saying, we risk losing our own role and our own responsibility and the beauty that our ancestors have gifted us. And the very end of the book, you have a series of beautiful chapters on song lines and what does it mean about worldviews that are conjured by words. I really love all of your titles to your chapters, by the way. They're just very poetic. And I'm kind of like, I keep thinking you're going to like write a poem about each chapter. Maybe that'll be a future project you'll do. I don't know. And building a relationship with the storied land in this last chapter, you give a story of going to Germany and finding at the Rhine River the elegant silhouette of the Lorelei outcropping. And you kind of, before this, the very end of the book, you kind of give a section, you talk about the Lorelei. And I'm wondering if you can just give just tell our reader or tell our listeners a tiny bit about what is and who is the Lorelei.
Yeah, I was very intrigued, on my own journey of exploring, my own ancestral roots and connecting with the land of my ancestors. I was very taken by also looking at, as other scholars have done and other researchers around, the stories and how they carry this ecological knowledge, and knowing that some fairy tales and myths and so forth, carry the seeds of a lot of this knowledge. And so I was really taken by the story of the Lorelei, which is an outcropping in the Rhine River. And knowing that a lot of the more modern stories about the Lorelei have been co-opted and Christianized and colonized. And so I wanted to sort of dig further into that meaning, because as I outline in the book, some of the more modern stories about the Lorelei, and they're sort of degrading, if you will, and they are patriarchal and sort of have a negative connotation about the Lorelei. But as I dug further and looked for key words in the story, one thing that really popped out at me, which becomes apparent, and I don't want to sort of give away the whole story, better for people to read it, but there were certain key words in there that led me to really discovering who the Lorelei actually was, away from the colonized versions of the modern renditions of that story. And that came about through going to the land and being on the land and having the land directly teach me and my friends who I went with, where we were able to discover who the Lorelei, to me, really is, and my own interpretation from listening to the land and having an experience on the land. And as I say, I think it's better for the reader to read the story and get the surprise at the end than me to share it here. But I would just encourage people to go on those journeys of understanding that in a lot of these ancient texts or mythologies or stories we hear from our own ancestors, that there's a lot of knowledge in them. And I think I would add to that, since you had mentioned, how words and stories can conjure worldviews, which is really the focus of the end of the book, how, I've been really intrigued by language itself and sort of get into that in those chapters. And just to give a practical example, I was with my friend Milan, who is Czech, and we were in his homelands, and I was trying to learn a little bit about his language, and I was really loving the way that the old Slavic roots of the old Slavic language really help us narrate the physical activities of plants and animals and humans taking place in the region during specific times of the year. So the names really beckon the speaker of these languages to listen to the living earth and the seasons in an integrated relationship. So as an example, January is laden or ice, February is unar, hibernation or ice lowers, March is bretzen, the birch or sap, what's when the sap of the trees is coming out. In April, it's called duben or the oak. In May is kvetten, the blossoms or the flowering time. In June is Seraven, red. In July is Sevanek, the redder or ripening time. And then August is Srepen, sickle, when they're going out and harvesting. And September is Ari, the blazing or the glowing sun. And in October or Zrisian is the rutting, when all the deer are rutting. In November is Listopad, the leaves are falling. In December is Prosenek, is kind of translated as slaughter of the pig, but Milan explained to me that it's like asking for something. It's when you have the animals make the giveaway for the feasts, and you're asking that food from the land. And so I just mention this because of how the language itself can be a way to directly connect us to the land, and how we describe the months, and how even just saying those words then connect us into what's happening with the cycles, versus just sort of these words that then, for me, when I say January, I'm just sort of thinking of, a word that is that month, versus how does it connect to the land itself and my relationship to the land. And so I really love also how we can have language that reconnects us and regenerates an earth living consciousness, which I'm really inspired about and think about all the time, is how do we regenerate our language to connect us to a living cosmos, a living earth.
Right. And I love that the example you're giving there is my calendar system. And I teach a lot on circular time and calendar, and kind of creating new calendar systems and reconnecting time to place, and language plays such a key role in that, obviously. And that the work that to shift our understanding of place entails shifting our understanding of time. And in a lot of these older languages, we find knowledge embedded in place names and temporal names, in descriptors of ancestors and of temporal, like epochs and days and months, and that are speaking to the landscape, and usually also speaking to a mythological framework, to a cosmovision in which the landscape is both sacred but is part of a bigger story, of which we are also a part. It's such a great example, and I really thank you so much for sharing that example. And this work of digging into language and digging into our ancestors, it's so, and excavating the past is so deeply connected to the work of justice, and is connected to the possibilities by movements such as some of the ones you've been most involved in, including the rights of nature movement. And I'm like wondering if you can just like, how are you experiencing and seeing in your colleagues the relationship between the really kind of exciting historical and mythological engagement with ancestral stories, and what it means to be working with to shift a legal system, which is so contemporary and so modern in so many ways, to enable a rights of nature worldview, perspective, system that can actually help to give different types of voices to some of the most important beings in our ecosystem, our mountains and our forests and our rivers.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that, in terms of just for the listeners to maybe just have a little bit of background around rights of nature. It's actually one of the fastest growing movements right now around the world, and it really aspires to recognize nature legally and culturally as a rights-bearing entity. And I think it really offers long-term systemic solutions to interlocking crises. And at its core, Rights of Nature presents a worldview and shift from an ideology of human dominion over nature to understanding and practicing that humans, in all of our diversity, are but one part of the sacred ecological systems of life. And here again, I just like to mention Indigenous peoples, to understand how important it is to recognize that it really is a new sort of form of earth jurisprudence, but it really comes from the knowledge of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous rights and traditional ecological knowledge, that the rights of nature movement was really born from those ideas. And it's really asking, how can we address root causes and enact systemic change in order to reorient a human presence that is earth enhancing and reciprocal with the natural world, so that we can live in harmony with each other and Mother Earth. And a primary impediment lies with our current legal framework, which needs, I think, to be challenged and changed. And most countries have environmental laws, but they're clearly not working, or we wouldn't be in this environmental and climate crisis if those laws are functioning to guide us to a proper human activity. We wouldn't be careening off a cliff right now. And in this context, I think rights in nature has the potential to not only help prevent some of the worst effects of the climate change and ecological devastation, but also can help us restore the role of humans as beneficial species to our Earth. So over the past 3 decades, environmental lawyers, visionary thinkers, Indigenous leaders, and activists around the world have been developing this new theory of jurisprudence, the rights of nature approach, which really promotes a structure of law that recognizes that our living planet has rights of its own. So when a rights of nature legal framework is implemented, environmentally disruptive activities that harm the ability of ecosystems and natural communities to thrive and naturally restore themselves are deemed legal violations of nature. And this rights of nature framework recognizes the inherent meaning, sacredness, and value of the natural world, and not reducing it to mere economic value. And that's really key. It's like respecting these rights along with human rights. So I think it's really important to understand that rights of nature really turns our legal system on its head. It's a very different DNA, if you will, of understanding how we are part and particle of nature. And I think it's also important that we see that it is also a way of addressing social injustice, because we need a way to address and have a framework that's large enough to also address colonization, environmental racism, patriarchy, and capitalism. And what I love about the rights of nature framework, it's a big enough framing to include that, as an example, capitalism, which is based on a legalized ownership of the earth, that needs to stop. And within the rights of nature framework, we would also be looking at reorienting our economic frameworks. So I would also say that it's exciting to know that the rights of nature movement is being implemented. It's not just an idea. In 2008, Ecuador became the first country in the world to recognize rights of nature in its constitution, which has been really exciting. And there have been efforts in Ecuador that have really been successful, like at the Vicabamba River, when a lawsuit filed to protect that river from a widening road. They used rights of nature legislation. We've seen rights of nature cases across the United States being brought forward. There's been over 36 cases of protecting communities from harmful fracking, from different sewage plants going through. Indigenous people in North America also are implementing rights of nature. In the Ponca Nation, they made history as the first tribe in the U.S. to implement rights of nature laws to protect their territory from fossil fuel extraction, which is causing just huge amounts of asthma and cancer and earthquakes in Oklahoma. We have also seen some really exciting work taking place in New Zealand, where they have now had the Wanganui River become a relative, recognized legally as a relative. And again, through a lot of leadership to Indigenous people, or as an example, I'll just lastly mention in 2018, the Colombian Supreme Court of Justice issued a ruling to halt deforestation in the Colombian Amazon, granting the forest status as a rights-bearing entity deserving protection and restoration. So, in essence, I'm just giving some of these examples to show like rights of nature is being implemented. I think we need to bring a lot more attention to it, because it's a framework that both legally and culturally completely transforms our duty relationship and understanding of how we need to be living in harmony with the land and having a legal system to actually represent that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And for for those listeners who want to also kind of explore more on this, in addition, this is so much on this. We did a podcast a couple of months ago with Erin Matariki Carr from New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand. Kind of got into some of the histories from the Maori and the Maori's involvement in some of the older rights of nature work, which is I think it's a particularly beautiful podcast. I like most of the podcasts. I'm biased. And so in your book, when you're talking about the rights of nature, you're talking also about, you give an example of a tribunal, and you kind of actually like go through the process of the tribunal in some detail. And it's a really interesting part of what I found interesting about the tribunal process that you're describing is, it's happening in the midst of COP. It's as I'm understanding this correctly, that tribunal is just happening in the midst of an international gathering, and the tribunal is not a legally binding effort, but it's kind of like giving an example. It is putting on trial, as you're saying, so many of these different cases from around the world. I'm kind of curious about, what's your thought of these? We might think of them as shadow institutions, or of these initiatives to create spaces that are outside of the contemporary legal framework, or outside of what's kind of considered like a normal way of doing, of hosting and talking about international affairs, but is right next to it. It's adjacent to it, and it often in this case, it did garner media attention, and it was very impactful. Certainly, it was very meaningful for everyone who was participating in it. And like, what's your thought about the role of these spaces, right? Because you're helping to cultivate spaces for new ways of doing things that's not in the contemporary organizational institutional structure.
Yeah, it's a great question. So yeah, exactly. I mean, the rights of nature work is happening, very much at the local level with local ordinances, or, different countries bringing rights of nature into their constitution. So there's many levels that rights of nature is in operation right now all over the world and growing, as I mentioned. But the reason that the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature, which WECAN and I am a part of, I sit on the executive committee of the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature, which if folks want to learn more, it's the website there is Rights of Nature. And Global Alliance for Rights of Nature, or GARN, has been quite active over the last years.
And all of our references will be in the show notes for anyone if you want to follow up on anything that we're talking about here.
Okay, great. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And so we have done various rights of nature tribunals in parallel, as you said, to the UN climate conferences that happen annually. And there's a conference of parties, or the COPs. And one of the primary reasons that we have selected those times to host the tribunals is precisely as you were outlining, which is to offer an alternative viewpoint on how we could be conducting international affairs that involve all countries and all peoples. And so I think why it's so important is that we are in a time where the systems we're operating in are collapsing. They're corrupt, they're collapsing, they're detrimental, whether it's, whether it is instigated by racism or capitalism or colonization or patriarchy. These are systems that have been extremely harmful to humans and the earth, and they need dismantling. And so a primary focus is how do we dismantle these systems of oppression, which are all interlocking and impacting people all over the world, and especially Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color, as we see white supremacy really being at the root of so many of these problems. While we are in the process of doing that, we also need to be pointing a vision forward. What do we want? How do we want to be living? And so by having these tribunals take place in parallel to the climate negotiations, we are giving people who are there at these international convenings, as well as the media and the press, an opportunity to learn something very different and have a very different perspective as to how we can conduct international governance. And so it's been really exciting to manifest these tribunals and to be able to give voice to so many things that are not given voice to in the formal climate negotiations, as an example. So, one of the cases you were talking about is, this was one of the tribunal cases was around a road that was proposed to go through Bolivia, and the Tipnis Road. And it was at the time the tribunal was taking place, it was a huge conflict that was going on in Bolivia. And even though the tribunal was not legally binding and was offered as an educational format for people to learn more about rights of nature advocacy and to learn about actually the mechanism of rights of nature, we did garner a lot of press because it was such a hot topic in Bolivia. And we had, leaders who were resisting the road going through in Tipnis, a very environmental sensitive area, an area that would infringe on Indigenous rights and Indigenous lifeways, and had Indigenous leaders come and speak at the tribunal. And the press picked up on it and brought it back to Bolivia, and it created a huge uproar and caused at that time the president of Bolivia to take a step back. And so it had real-time impact, which was very exciting. But also I would say that, there, like I mentioned, there's already a lot of rights of nature cases being won all over the world. So it's a matter of having these tribunals be in an international arena where people can learn about the ideas, share ideas, and understand that cases are being won, and where people can actually pick up on these ideas and bring them back to their own community. So I think it's been really successful in that way, and that we need to continue to show what it is that global movements are wanting, what communities are wanting, what are community-led solutions. And I would just mention one other idea, if you don't mind, bringing in something that I think is really important because of what's been happening in the last few years, parallel to the climate talks, which are crawling along, is I'm also very honored to be on the steering committee of something called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has been chaired by a really brilliant woman, Zipporah Berman, and her entire team. And basically, what this fossil fuel treaty does is it is really designed to work in parallel to the very important climate Paris Agreement, which mainly deals with carbon emission reductions, but not directly with fossil fuels and the supply end of the problem of the climate crisis, which is gas, oil, and coal. And it deals with how do we actually create a treaty where all governments agree to stop expansion and extraction of fossil fuels. And so, again, that's been a very positive impact. More and more countries are signing on to this treaty. At COP28, Colombia signed on. There's many others led by island nation peoples, Vanuatu and others. But what was exciting to me at COP28 is that Colombia signed on, which is a fossil fuel producing country. So this whole question of how we're going to get off of fossil fuels is huge. At COP28, fossil fuels were finally drug onto center stage into the negotiations. And though we did not get a fossil fuel phase out, which is what civil society was really demanding and vulnerable countries were really demanding, we did get into the text, that countries agree to transitioning off of fossil fuels. So it's definitely not strong enough. But in other words, we're moving towards getting off of fossil fuels, which is absolutely essential. But this non-proliferation treaty is really important because, again, it's outside of the formal context of negotiation, but provides what are we wanting, stating it really explicitly and creating these venues like rights of nature and the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, traditional ecological knowledge, Indigenous rights, all these things that we know are the real solutions we need, feminist economies, degrowth economies, buen vivir, all these different ideas that we need to really interject onto the mainstream conversation is something that I'm really excited about and know is the direction that we need to be advocating for and really pressuring governments and societies to bring into, mainstream conversations and media.
So then that kind of brings me to a question that I keep mulling over, which is, obviously, I know in the multiple times I've been to COP, the most valuable conversations and moments that I have are with people who are a little bit like me already, who share some common values and goals, and who are also brought together. Maybe they're in civil society, maybe they're in the government, maybe they're in the corporate sector, but they kind of come into the spaces with a similar, some basic similar ethos that has been, and the things that emerge from those conversations and alliances and possibilities that we see in one another. And yet, that feeling of being so close to watching something happen and yet feeling also very impotent and also very like bored at the moment of like watching people argue about things and feeling like nothing is going to change. And people have been having these COP conversations for so many years. And of course, there's Rio before that. And the sense that we're still just rearranging chairs in the Titanic, And I'm just curious, like, what do you see as the value, if any, of these kind of ongoing spaces, such as ongoing international spaces where it feels like often it's just the same old business as usual. And I don't know how much listening is actually happening. Even when people break down in tears on the floor, as happened with Philippines a couple of years ago. And people tried many tactics to make these meetings go further and faster. And it continues to just feel like a slog. So I'm just like curious, why do you keep showing up?
It's a great question, and it is a slog. I would definitely agree with you there. I mean, I think that, it's a space that, one, I think it's really important to say that in terms of WECAN, it's one portion of our work. I definitely would not put all of our eggs in that basket. Let's be real about that. It's one part of the work. I mean, we spend most of our time in communities doing food sovereignty, food security work, fighting for Indigenous rights. We do a lot of campaigns to stop fossil fuel projects, or meeting with financial institutions to get them to stop investing in bad projects, growing forests. There's a lot of work that we do that is very independent of going to the UN climate conferences, just to be clear about that. But why do we go is because there's a couple of things that I think are important. One, I don't think everyone should go. And two, I don't think that we're going there because we think the answers are there. So all of those qualifiers have to be in place. We go because I believe and have experienced that if civil society is not there creating our demands and being, as observers in the negotiating rooms, having interventions, things would be far, far worse than they are now. I think it is singularly civil society and brave and courageous, vulnerable countries, island nation countries, and others that are continuing to push the agenda. So we're already up against tremendous odds with the climate crisis and environmental degradation. And we have such a narrow opportunity, as scientists are telling us, to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. At that 1.5 degree guardrail. I mean, the window is so small that every little fraction of wind that we can have, or resistance, or intervention at these climate talks to keep things better from the worst of the worst, I think is incredibly valuable. So I'll give you just a few practical examples. Because there's nothing to be said about the speed or scale or progress or the justice frameworks at the COP. I mean, we will continue to fight for those things, but, they're definitely not the strong suit, to say it mildly. But when we were in Paris during, when the Paris Climate Agreement was finalized, It was a huge fight that happened because of civil society and the high ambition countries, which were a small group of vulnerable countries, that fought for the 1.5 degree guardrail. Everyone was pushing for 2 degrees. And because of that, 1.5 degrees was put into the Paris Climate Agreement. For us as advocates, that has been critical because there's all these pledges by governments or financial institutions that we're in constant work with to advocate for better policies or to stop bad projects, that they have agreed to this 1.5 degree guardrail is a huge advocacy point for us, that we can call them out and say, you know what, you're not adhering to the Paris Climate Agreement like you said you're going to do. So it's a big leverage point for us that we won that. It's no small thing whatsoever. And now, last year, after decades of civil society fighting for loss and damage, we got the loss and damage mechanism in place. Is it good enough? Is it fast enough? No, but it forced governments to deal with inequity. It forced them to deal with the huge issue of the fact that the big polluting countries need to be responsible to other countries for the damages that are being caused by the countries who've done the least to contribute to the climate crisis. That loss and damage fund is huge, not just in the sense of the fact that funds need to go to countries to survive the climate crisis and transition into renewable energy, but to force countries to be honest about the fact of the inequities and the wealthy countries and the harms that they're causing globally. So there's a lot going on there that is part of changing our narrative, as incremental it is, and forcing the conversations that need to be had that I don't see taking place anywhere else at that level, because you're talking to country leaders, you're actually in their face. And that makes a huge difference. Like I said, it's not the center of where all the change is taking place. But if we're talking about how we need to engage everyone, which we do, we need to have a way to have governments involved. And just lastly, I'd say at COP28, it was never on the formal agenda to talk about a fossil fuel phase out, which is critical to any effort going forward to stop the climate crisis. That was because of civil society and vulnerable countries forcing them to talk about the fossil fuel phase out. And it became part of every negotiation. Every negotiating room had to deal with that issue. So again, if we're looking for all the big answers to happen there, no. But if we're looking there to have intervention and to interrogate, this is a key component of the ecosystem. It's not the only one, but it's a key component.
And so given all the caveats, what do you think it's going to take? And what kind of collective action might be required to change the worldviews of our governments?
Gosh, if I knew that. It's if I knew that. I mean, I think it's like really looking at the nature of change itself, the change of consciousness. And I have seen policy changes. I have seen government leaders make change. I don't think that change is impossible at that level, but I think it takes an enormous amount of energy from civil society, grassroots efforts. That's where the change is happening. And the push from the bottom up is how those changes take place. And that's true historically. So I think that we make the change through the constant effort of all the actors from the grassroots and the solutions that we're offering. I think that's where we begin to infiltrate and intervene the narrative and the ideas through these spaces, and also make sure that we take time in our own spaces, because we also know that sometimes change happens outside of the system and things click over. It's not linear. Change is not linear. So as we build our community strength, and we live the lives that we know are valuable, and we heal our ancestries, and we do all this other work, things are going on that are not linear in change. And I think we also need to not have in a Pollyanna way, think like, oh, it's just going to magically all change. No, not whatsoever. But I do think there's a lot to be said about building the reality that we want, and then change happens in ways that we don't always foresee, because there's cracks in the system right now, and that leaves room for unusual changes to occur that are really necessary right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Well, there's so many other things that we can meander into and talk about and connect with each other and for others and for ourselves. But we're coming towards the end of our time for this podcast, and I would really love to end it with a question that I like to ask people when I remember to do so, which is, as we kind of go forward today, what are you remembering, and what are you inviting our audience to be in the process of remembering?
Remembering who we are in the earth lineage, remembering that we all have a role to play, remembering that everyone is part of this great moment of transformation that we're in, remembering our ancestors, as we've been talking about, remembering our rootedness in Mother Earth wherever we are, even if we live in the city that below the cement, Mother Earth is the center heartbeat, and the birds are overhead, and the sky is overhead, and the stars and the sun are always there, and staying really connected to the more than human world, and feeling the presence of life, and that we're part of life. And yes, humanity is in this crisis moment, but we also have a lot to offer this moment, and it's not over. I don't want people to lose hope or to be pessimistic. I think that we can be very critical, we can grieve, we can hurt, we can be angry and frustrated, which are all very real responses to a lot of horrific things that are going on in our world right now. But that we can pull from each other as a community, and that we can pull from our connection to the land and hold strength in that. And yeah, I want us to remember that we're together.
Let us indeed remember that we are together, that the story that we are is in our bones is one that does not end, and that we are very much a part of it. It is a part of us, and the final chapters are in no way close to having been written or told or lived out. Thank you so much, Osprey, for joining us on the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. As always, many of the references will be in the show notes. And, just really, really wishing you well, and really giving much gratitude for you and for the many, many women, named and unnamed, in your book and in your life, and who are surrounding you, and this larger sisterhood that you are every day working to strengthen, to encourage, to give blessings and receive blessings from, and to be in reciprocity with. So many thanks to you, and for the many, many people who are surrounding you. I can feel them in many of the things you're saying here, even though we didn't talk about a lot of them directly. I know that they are also very much a part of all of this, and that, may the words that we've been sharing here, may they echo into blessings for the women who surround us.
Thank you. Perfectly said. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and reenchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Summit Via website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarajolena.com.